In the context of large language models and agents, and especially the question of how do large language models use tools or agents use tools is something that I get quite a bit. And so what I wanted to go over today is really how do large language models know, quote unquote, know that they have tools available to them, and how does it actually trigger that tool use, and where does that decision actually get made in the entire chain. So what I'd like to talk about now is sort of tool use in particular. So the theme of some of these videos that I've been making have been, how do we go from a base sort of large language model or chat model to something more complex like an agent. And tool use is an important part of what agents can do. And so for some context, what I've talked about before, and you can look at other videos, a large language model basically is just this sort of large, I'll just describe it as a box here, like a black box. It is a bunch of matrix multiplications essentially, and I can give it a prompt, and it's a text prompt. And I talked about it has to fit within what we call a context window. It's going to be a fixed size, and the whole job of this matrix multiplication is to try to predict the next word. Now, the auto-regressive nature, so there's a little wrapper around this base model that will allow it to sort of auto-regressively predict the next word, select the next word, feed it back into the prompt, run it through again, predict the next word, and just auto-regressively build it out. Eventually it comes across an end token, some token that says, hey, guess what? You should stop now. What you get at the other end is this response, which also kind of needs to fit within this context window. And by context window, I mean it's sort of a fixed size of token, fixed number of tokens that it can really process at once. And there are some techniques for trying to wrap it around so you can get more tokens in there than normal, but the context size is fixed. So this is a regular sort of autoregressive, chat model. And what makes it a chat model is that the large language model might be some sort of supervised fine-tuning or reinforcement learning with human feedback or some other mechanism which is going to get it to be nice and helpful and answer responses for you. And it becomes like this chat model. So with agents or agentic workflows, what you do is you take this base model and you connect it to other things. You have sort of an orchestration layer, which is going to have multiple calls to these large language models and get it to do things that are more interesting than just give me a prompt and give me a response. You can now start to do things based on the response. You might sort of have if-then type logic. You might let it decide its logic. And we'll talk about more of that. And there is a video where I sort of lay some of this out. But the question I get a lot is about tool use. So how does this large language model know what tools it has available? Well, what is tool use to begin with? How does it know what tools it has available to it? And then how does it decide in some sense which tool it should use? And then how does it execute that? What actually happens after? So where does it, peeling back the layers of how this might work. And so this is what I want to talk about now. So one, it's part of this exploration, not to show you just a bunch of code here, but as part of this exploration, I've been looking at LangGraph. So LangGraph is created by the same people that did LangChain. And this is just a sort of a wrapper around, a sets of tools for making agents. And so let's forget about that for a second. What I want to focus on is number one, sort of tools are really just functions here. So here's an example of one. This is from one of the tutorials that they had early on. Here I'm just defining a function that says multiply, and it's going to have two different numbers. Here they're integers, and it's going to give me another integer back. Here's a little bit of a description of how that actually works. And then here is actually what happens. So if you give me, this function says, if you give me a number A, a number B, I'm going to return the multiplication of that. So it's just a function. Now in this case, it's a super easy, like literal function that just is executed in Python. But you can also do other things inside this function. It could be more complicated. It could be a call to an API. So there might be some external API which is going to give me, given some locations, I might be able to get the directions, like a Google Maps or something like this. It might be able to get information about what's available on the menu from a particular restaurant or something like that. You can stick things inside of this function, and tools really are just these functions. And so there are a structured way that functions want to take inputs, and then there's going to be some structured output, some specific output to that function. So the first thing I want to highlight is really tools are just functions. Those could be very complicated functions that involve external API calls to other, services out there in the world. It could be a Google search. It could be other kinds of web search. It could be simple like this, where it's literally just doing a little bit of mathematics or executing like a Python function. But at the end of the day, it's really just this function where I have a structured input and I've got a structured output. Now, in the case of, and let's not focus so much on LangChain or LangGraph, but basically the way that it works is that you want to somehow associate this function with the large language model. So here we have, this is GPT-4o is the language model. And here, this is just instantiating, I'm going to have this large language model. This is my model. This is the thing that I had in the black box earlier. I've defined this function, and now in LangChain, they have this little thing called bind tools. So again, don't worry so much about the implementation, it's the concept. And so here I'm binding this tool called multiply. I'm adding it in. And it's important to note, I could have added many of them here. Here I just did one, but I could have had many tools that I've bound. So what does this actually do? So in reality, what this is doing, like how does it now know? Like what does it mean to know that this large language model is now a large language model with access to tools? Well, what basically happens is this logic, what it's going to do is it's going to say, all right, I need to describe to the large language model the fact that I have this tool and how it's used. So if you want to use this tool, you're going to need to structure it in a particular way so that you can give me two integers, and what's going to be given back is going to be the multiple of those two integers. And I might want to describe to it the context in which I want to use it. What basically this tool does is it creates a system prompt specifically for this tool. So this is just text describing what's the format, what is this tool, how would I call it, what format do I need to have in order to get it, and when would you use this? And so this system prompt basically is just, again, it's just a string. It's a bunch of tokens. And so now when I call this large language model with tools, whatever I ask it, so here I'm going to ask it something. So whatever that might be, how do I get to the store or whatever? Or what is 3 times 5? I'm going to ask it something. And when I ask it, it's going to, because I've bound a tool, and so when I ask this model that has these tools bound to it, unbeknownst to me, this bind tools is going to attach the system prompt to it. And so this is going to fill up some of that context window. And it's going to say, hey, as you're deciding how to help this user, remember you've got this tool multiply at your fingertips, or you have this tool multiply at your fingertips. This is how you use it. This is the structure you need to have if you want to use it. And you've got these other tools. And so there's other options for tools that you could use as well. And so all of that gets put into the system prompt that I don't see when I call this. And so then when the large language model takes in all that context, it is deciding what to do next. So if I go back to, I think I got rid of that actually. When I go back to my large language model, I'm feeding this in, it's still doing the same thing. It's predicting the next token, the next token, the next token. But inside the weights here, because it has this system prompt in its context, it could decide that the next token is, I'm going to start to call one of these tools. And I know how to structure it because this system prompt told me how to structure it. So the decision kind of gets made at the point inside the large language model. It's not that I have some external function outside of the large language model that tells me filter through the user's prompts and then tell me if there's 2 integers, then I'm going to use the multiply. No, the large language model is just going to take this all into its context, and it decides, in quotes again, whether that tool is called. And how you know that it's deciding that is because it starts structuring its outputs to be specifically calling that tool. And LangChain has this tooling available to detect when that's happening, when it reads the outputs. So Another thing that I want to mention here is not all large language models are going to be great at doing this. But all of the big ones like Claude from Anthropic and GPT-4o in this case here, or one of the OpenAI models, they've actually been trained to be good at giving these tools back. So it knows, it's seen the way this tool calling happens. So even though it's a large language model, and probably any large language model will at some point, given the context, be able to use tools, these models in particular, or some models in particular, are just better at it because they've been trained, some fine-tuning's happened that trained them to be good at calling this. So if you give me the structure of the output, I could give you that structured in the output here. So that's the basic idea. Now, some of the problems are, so let's see this in action here. So here's an example of, this is a basic tool calling LLM. And so I'm going to give it, and this is just a line graph studio version of this. Here's my tool calling LLM. I'm going to give it some prompt, and it can do two things. It could just output something, and if it's just regular old text and nothing else funny, it will just give me that text back. But if the text is structured like the tool call, and I have this one, I only have the multiply attached to it, it might go through and actually execute that tool. So do the multiply function and output it. So if I put a message in here, so here's the human talking to it. So if I say, tell me a short story 2 lines long and press submit, what you'll see is that it gives me a really short story. So it goes straight from the tool right out. It didn't use straight from the large language model, it just gives me text out. So it never called this tool, and it just said lost in a dense forest, Lily found a glowing map, blah blah blah. Okay, so now it didn't use that tool, so it decided in some sense that all it was going to output was just ordinary text, even though it knew, and when I say no, it's because it was in the system prompt that there is this multiply available to it. It didn't use it. It just was putting out these tokens, and it never called the tool. So I can do another run here, and instead I can say, what is 4 times 5? So it's this, again, the exact same large language model. It's just now let's see what happens. Now what we see is it went through this tool. And so it structured the output. It said, hey, guess what? It decided that 4 times 5 means, hey, I have this function I have available to me, this tool. Let me structure the outputs so that I know that A is going to be 4, B is going to be 5. I use that tool. The output of that tool is just the output of a function, and that's 20. Now, it doesn't do anything fancier than that. You could, in theory, loop that 20 back into here and structure it in a more narrative way as an output. But for right now, this is a very simple, I call it a router, that gives you an option of either giving you a direct output or giving you an output that is going to be the tool call, and then the tool gets executed by this little box here. And so this is the basic idea of tool calls. So if I go back to this, tools are basically functions, and which is structured input and a structured output. When I bind those tools to a large language model, all I'm really doing is giving it a sort of a complicated system prompt that says, hey, here's this tool available to you, large language model. And if you would like to use this tool under these circumstances was when you might want to use it, then you would output the structure the output in this way. And then once I have that tool using large language model now that has that system prompt, and the only difference is that there's an extra system prompt that's sort of you don't see attached to it. In some cases, it will just give you a response if it decides that it doesn't need it. But if they think it's a situation that this tool will be useful, it might route it over, and the output would be structured in a way that the orchestration layer will recognize that, oh, here's a tool, and I'm going to run that function. So it structures the output to be A is 4, B is 5, and then it's going to execute that tool, which the output of which is 20. So hopefully that was useful at a high level to see how these large language models, which go from basically just predicting the next word to giving them the ability to see what tools it has available to it, and then how it decides, quote unquote, to execute that. One of the problems and one of the issues that I face as an AI auditor and a risk professional is understanding what are the risks associated with this sort of thing. So the one thing I will say that maybe goes without saying is that as you add more and more tools to a large language model like this, it is going to struggle, or there's a chance that it struggles deciding amongst those tools. And because it has lots of choices and it has to, contextually be aware of when it's important to use those tools. And of course, you're also filling up the context window with these system prompts. And so there's a chance that you're sort of running out of space for it to think over those tokens. So in any case, hopefully this was useful, and I'll talk to you again next week.